Hi everyone, welcome back to the medical school application guide video series. Today we're going to be talking about how to make a good medical school list. Crafting a well-balanced medical school list is easily one of the most underrated parts of the application process. Spending an extra day making sure that you meet the admissions criteria for the schools that you're applying for can dramatically improve the number of interview invites that you get. So I'm splitting this video into two parts, the first part being drafting the list and the second part being narrowing down the list. The first and easiest step is going to be to add your state medical schools to your list. For example, I was a California applicant applying to MD schools. So here I have a list of all of the possible MD schools I could have applied to, but I narrowed it down based off of my values and criteria I was looking for within schools. So you can pause the video and see all of the examples for why I didn't apply to certain schools in my state. But you're likely going to be applying to most or all of your state schools. Next, I would highly recommend getting MSAR, which is a tool from the AAMC that costs around $25 per year for a subscription, and it shows you data on all of these medical schools, for instance, the median MCAT and GPA, the location, and then you can filter schools by certain criteria. So inputting your scores and also your location preferences, you'll get an entire list of schools that you can then add to your list. Another tool that is actually free is the WARS tool that was created by a user on SDN. And you can subjectively rate yourself on the following criteria that are listed here. I put some screenshots of an example of using the WARS system, and it tells you the proportion of each category of schools that you should apply to based off of all of these factors considered. Some major pros to this tool are that it's straightforward to use and it can give you a sense of whether your school list is unbalanced or not based off of your MCAT and GPA. So for instance, if you're applying to too many reach schools that have a way higher median stat range, or maybe if you're applying to too many research heavy schools when your application is more service focused. However, a major con is that it's still very subjective, so you might over or undersell yourself when you're taking into account all of these criteria. And so I would use a combination of the MSAR and the WARS tool to begin to draft a list of schools in desirable locations, and also considering your MCAT and GPA to be within a few points of the median for each school. Next, I'm going to be talking about schools to consider carefully before applying to see if you meet their admissions criteria. This can save you a lot of time and money. So earlier we talked about applying to your state schools, but what if you don't have a state medical school? So for folks in like Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and Idaho, you might not have a state medical school. That's why the University of Washington has a partnership with those 4 states as well as its own home state of Washington. Because of this, if you do not meet the criteria of being in one of those 5 states, it is very, very hard to get accepted. So unless you strongly meet their mission statement or you are from one of these 5 states, it is very unlikely that you will be given an interview invite. Similarly, OHSU has very specific mission statements that you need to meet, and they also have a very high in-state preference. Next, you want to be cautious of low yield schools. A school might get a ton of applications because there's either a very short or no secondary, or it's in a very desirable location. And so these are usually considered low yield schools. They get over 10,000 applications and extend proportionally a very, very small number of interview invites. I put a list of these schools on this slide. Of course, if you meet a school's mission statement and you believe you are a good fit, you should still apply, but I just wouldn't apply to too many of these schools thinking that they might be within your stat range and likely to extend an interview invite. Let's talk about in-state versus out-of-state schools. So usually when you're applying to your state medical schools, you have an in-state preference because you are a resident from that state. However, if you're applying to out-of-state public schools, usually you will have a bit of a disadvantage because of that in-state preference that exists for other applicants. Schools like Washington State pretty much only take residents or people with ties. So as you can see here, 91.3% of all of their matriculants were Washington residents, and 8.7% had ties to Washington in one of their class years. A good way to check if a out-of-state school is okay with out-of-state applicants is to look up the name of the School of Medicine and then class demographics. Usually you'll be able to find a stat like this on their website. However, some public schools like the University of Michigan will have a very high percentage of out-of-state matriculants. So if you're applying to schools out of state, you want to see something like this. Michigan has 59.5% out-of-state matriculants. Generally, I think I'd avoid out-of-state schools that accept less than 30 or 40% of their class out of state. I would also like to touch on the commonly given advice of filtering schools by their mission statement. For most schools, I feel like honestly the mission statement kind of blends in, with the exception of a few of the schools that I just talked about to be careful when considering to apply. My advice is to apply more broadly and then choose what schools that you fit the mission for after you get acceptances. The exceptions would be, again, for those special schools like UW, OHSU, and low yield schools that have very specific mission statements that you might want to check out. Another reason I don't think you should filter by mission statement is because you might perceive your application as being, for instance, more social justice focused, when in reality you have a lot more research experiences that the adcoms are going to be focusing on. In other words, it's really hard to tell how your application is going to be perceived by the admissions committee. Alright, now going into part 2 of the video, which is narrowing down your school list. A common question that you might have is, how many schools should I apply to in total? According to the AMC, in the 2021 to 22 application cycle, there was an average of 18 applications per applicant. This is an increase from previous cycles where the average was reported to be 16. However, I suspect that the average for matriculants would be actually slightly higher. So I would take this to mean that at minimum, you should be applying to around 18 to 20 schools. Of course, there are going to be other considerations that factor into how many schools that you apply to. The main one being your budget for primary and secondary costs. This slide shows you all of the costs that you need to factor in when applying to medical schools. Your total cost is going to be $195 plus $145 times the number of schools that you're applying to, plus 12 times the number of schools that have Casper or the Altus suite. This is a great time to remind you to check the AMC fee assistance program, and if you qualify, it will waive some of these fees up until a certain number of schools. When are you applying to too many schools to the point of affecting the quality of your secondaries? Personally, I think it'll probably start to burn out around the 35 mark, and I think that the cost benefit curve of applying to more schools will probably taper off around 25 to 30 schools. Again, it's much more important to have a well-balanced, thoughtfully crafted medical school list than it is to apply to a ton of schools randomly. So now let's recap with a little bit of a pop quiz. So let's say Sally is applying to medical schools with a 515 MCAT and a 3.7 GPA. She is a California applicant and a non-URM. So is this school list balanced? So I'll give you a few seconds to pause the video, think about it, and leave your response in the comments. Alright, so now that you have some time to think about it, I would say that this could be a better school list. So as you can see, the schools highlighted in bright pink are definitely very competitive schools, and they have median stats that are above her range. And she's also applying to 4 schools that are either low yield or do not favor out-of-state applicants. For applicants from California and New York especially, these states tend to be notoriously competitive when applying for medical schools because folks tend to want to stay within their home state. So I'd recommend Sally to apply to more schools, especially out-of-state private schools without significant in-state preference. And I'd also remove OHSU and UW and reconsider Brown and Tufts based on their mission statements. To conclude, I'm going to show you my school list as a California applicant. And so I applied to 34 schools on my primary and only completed 33 of those. I did not meet the chemistry requirement for UPIT. Please keep in mind, I'm just sharing this for some inspiration, not for you to copy. Please follow all of the tips I provided earlier in the video when making your own school list. For a completely different applicant with different stats and different application experiences and a different home state, this might be an awful school list. Hindsight is 2020. I think going back, I would have applied to less of those low yield schools. I'd also applied to a few schools last minute and was probably too late in the application process anyway to have a good chance at getting an interview invite. Of course, this is all in hindsight, so realistically, I probably wouldn't have changed a thing. By the end of this video, you should have all the tools you need to make a well-balanced school list. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. And I'll see you next time when we talk about what to do next now that you have a school list. Bye, everyone!